What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
When my parents said they couldn't help me with tuition, I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I just stared down at the cracked linoleum floor in our kitchen, wondering how they could look me in the eye and tell me that college was just too much right now. That everyone's struggling and that maybe a year off would give me perspective, all while my acceptance letter, offering a full ride to a school 2 states away, sat unopened on the dining table right behind them, still in its envelope, still exactly where I'd left it the night before in a small act of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would care enough to notice. I didn't expect balloons or confetti or one of those viral videos where the family jumps up screaming and the dad starts crying into his beer, but I thought I'd at least get a "we're proud of you" or "that's incredible, Rachel." Or even just the courtesy of someone asking why I looked like I hadn't slept in 3 days, because the truth was I hadn't, not since I found out I'd be leaving. Not since I realized I was finally going to escape this house where I was useful but never celebrated, present but always invisible. Instead, they were too focused on Dylan again. Dylan, who had just quit his second job in 6 months because, in his words, his manager didn't respect his vibes. Dylan, who barely passed his high school classes but still got to host his graduation party in our backyard with fairy lights and catering from that taco truck he liked, while I was told, back when I graduated with honors, that we'll just keep it simple this time. So when I heard them talking in the garage, Mom saying he needs this win, Pat. He's been trying, and Dad grumbling about interest rates, but caving like he always did, I didn't even go out there to stop them. I didn't ask where the money was coming from, or how they suddenly had enough, when 24 hours earlier they couldn't spot me $1,000 for books. I just stood in the hallway, biting the inside of my cheek so hard it bled, while Dylan walked in wearing a backwards cap and that smug little half-smile he always wore when he got away with something he absolutely shouldn't have. They handed him the keys to a brand new motorcycle, not even used, not even modest, but this gleaming black and chrome monster with red trim and custom exhaust, the kind you see on TV commercials with rock music blaring in the background. And then they brought out a chocolate cake that said, "In blue icing, you deserve this." I didn't even get a cupcake when I got into the honors program. Dylan revved the engine in the driveway like a child showing off a new toy, and when Mom clapped and Dad shouted, "Go easy on the clutch, son," I felt something in my chest snap, not loud, not violent, but like the quiet crack of a frozen branch just before it falls, something small and final that marked the end of whatever lingering hope I had that maybe, deep down, they saw me the way they saw him. So I said nothing. Not when Dylan did a crooked loop around the block like some kind of victory lap, not when Mom hugged him and wiped a tear from her cheek, not even when Dad turned to me and muttered, he really needed a win. I just nodded, walked back inside, and locked the bathroom door so I could finally open the envelope, the one they'd ignored, the one with the gold crest from Emerson State, and read, for the 100th time, the words that had changed everything. Congratulations. We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship covering all tuition, housing, and materials for the next 4 years. That was it. That was the moment I made a decision, not a loud or dramatic one, but a quiet, deliberate promise to myself. I would go. I would build a life without their applause, without their backup plans, without their conditional support. And I would never again ask them for anything. The next morning, I emailed the financial aid office, confirmed my spot, and started packing a single duffel bag while Dylan lounged in the living room and played video games at full volume. I packed my notebooks, my laptop, and 3 hoodies. I left behind the graduation certificate still rolled up in the hallway closet, left behind the family photos where I was always on the edge of the frame, and left behind any desire to be noticed by people who only seemed to look up when Dylan failed. When I loaded my things into the back seat of the Greyhound bus and sat near the window, I didn't cry. I didn't second-guess it. I just opened my laptop and started researching internship programs for my major, communications, with a focus on narrative strategy, because if there was one thing I'd learned in that house, it was that stories matter. The ones people tell about you. The ones you tell yourself. The ones you don't get to rewrite. And if they thought I was just going to quietly disappear into a dorm room and forget everything they'd said or didn't say, they were in for a surprise. Because I wasn't planning on disappearing. I was planning on winning. And this time, I'd do it quietly, just like they taught me. The dorm room wasn't anything special. 2 twin beds jammed between beige walls, a narrow desk with chipped drawers, and a window that overlooked a parking lot filled with students arriving late and parents crying behind steering wheels. But to me, it felt like breathing air for the first time in years, like stepping out of a long, silent tunnel where no one had ever asked me what I wanted or who I was becoming. And when my roommate, Claire, burst through the door dragging 3 mismatched suitcases and laughing because she'd already lost her key, I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't have to apologize for taking up space. I didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's disaster or lower my voice because Dylan was going through something, or pause in the middle of my sentence because my parents' eyes had drifted back to their phones mid-conversation. I could just exist, uninterrupted, unacknowledged maybe, but free. The first week was a blur of orientation sessions, RA meetings, textbook runs, and email chains from professors who already seemed impossibly distant and intimidating, but I didn't mind. If anything, I clung to the overload. I welcomed every reading assignment, every awkward icebreaker circle, every moment spent relearning how to be a human without the weight of other people's expectations pressing into my back. Claire made friends fast. She was loud, funny, and completely unbothered by the fact that she didn't know where anything was, and I liked that about her. She never made me feel like I had to match her energy. She just let me be, and in quiet moments between classes and meals, she'd shoot me these sideways glances like she was cataloging me for later, trying to figure out what storm I'd already weathered and how I'd managed to arrive on the other side without looking broken. Back home, I kept communication minimal. I didn't send pictures of my room or tell them about the welcome event where we wrote our dreams on paper lanterns and sent them floating over the soccer field. I didn't tell them about Professor Miles, who taught Intro to Strategic Storytelling and looked like he'd just wandered off a movie set with his gray beard and ancient leather satchel, or how he called on me in front of 200 students and told me my answer was the most damningly precise thing he'd heard all week. I didn't tell them about the student newspaper asking me to write after reading my orientation essay, or the girl from down the hall who said she'd never thought about her own family until she read what I wrote about mine. Instead, I sent a single text every Sunday, always the same format: class is going well. Hope you're good. And every week, my mom replied with some version of glad to hear. Dylan's applying to a warehouse job, or Dylan's thinking about starting a podcast, or once, unbelievably, we're so proud of Dylan for trying therapy. Baby steps. They never asked for my dorm address, never offered to send anything, never asked about my roommates, professors, or if I was homesick. And to be perfectly honest, I was relieved. Because I wasn't homesick. I was just beginning to understand that you don't miss what you never really had, and the further I got from them physically, emotionally, spiritually, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by quiet sacrifice. The kind that no one ever asked for, but everyone somehow expected. Claire's family sent care packages. Her mom texted every morning. Her dad mailed her a box of socks because she mentioned once that her feet were always cold. I watched her open those boxes on our shared rug with this expression that mixed embarrassment and affection, and I'd smile and tease her about being spoiled, but inside I felt this quiet ache that I couldn't quite name. Not jealousy. Not longing. Just a recognition that some people are raised on reinforcement while others are raised on restraint. I was learning how to live without applause, and maybe that made me stronger, but it also made me harder. Midway through the semester, I got an email from the dean's office notifying me that I'd made the academic leadership list for maintaining a GPA above 4.0, while also contributing to a campus publication. I stared at the screen for a full 5 minutes, not because I was surprised, but because I realized I had no one to forward it to. No one who would frame it, or share it on Facebook, or cry in the grocery store aisle when a neighbor said, "Your daughter's doing amazing." So I forwarded it to myself, archived it in a folder titled Things They'll Never Know, and moved on. On Thanksgiving, I stayed on campus. Claire went home to her loud, Italian family in Connecticut and offered, twice, to take me with her. But I said I had a paper to finish. I lied. I didn't want to risk standing in someone else's kitchen watching a mother dote on her daughters or a father pull out a chair with a smile. I didn't want to see what it looked like up close. Instead, I made boxed mac and cheese in a microwave, curled up with a used copy of The Art of War for my analysis paper, and rewatched old home videos on my laptop, the few that existed anyway. Dylan always at the center, always the one blowing out the candles or being carried on shoulders. I was there too, usually behind someone, clapping too late, or looking at the camera like I wasn't sure it was meant for me. That night, I posted a photo to my social feed, a shot of the library at sunset, golden light spilling through the arches, captioned simply, grateful. My mom liked it with a heart. No comment. No text. Just a button pushed. Claire came back from the holiday with pie, a thrifted sweater for me, and a story about how her cousin fell off a hoverboard in the kitchen. I laughed, harder than I had in months. She flopped onto her bed and tossed a pillow at me. You ever gonna tell them you're crushing it? She asked, not judgmental, just curious. I shrugged. What's the point? She looked at me for a long second, then said, so they don't get to pretend they helped when you win. And that hit me harder than I expected. Because she was right. One day, there would be a moment, a spotlight, a microphone, a crowd that couldn't be ignored, and I wasn't going to use it to thank people who hadn't shown up. I was going to use it to remember how I got there, one ignored update at a time. It was one of those absurdly warm spring afternoons when the campus felt like a postcard version of itself, with students sprawled out across the quad like they had nowhere urgent to be, half asleep on their backpacks, sun-drunk and unbothered. And I remember sitting under a sycamore tree outside the media building, working through the final draft of a project I'd been building for 3 months, something about corporate storytelling and the politics of silence, when Claire wandered over, iced coffee in hand and a grin on her face, waving her phone in the air like a flag of truce and saying, "You need to see this right now. Your brother is a genius." And I already knew, before the screen even turned toward me, before I saw the photo, before I read the caption, that something had gone catastrophically wrong in the exact, predictable way it always did when Dylan was involved. Because if there was one constant in the ever-evolving dysfunction of our family, it was that Dylan's disasters somehow always managed to become family emergencies, no matter how avoidable, no matter how self-inflicted, no matter how glaringly preventable they had been from the start. The image showed Dylan in a hospital bed, one arm in a sling, his face cut but smug, holding up a peace sign with a neck brace still strapped to his throat like it was a fashion statement, and the caption underneath read, "Sometimes you gotta fly too close to the sun." Still standing. #blessed total button broken. The post had over 200 likes, a small collection of prayer hands and heart emojis flooding the comment section, and somewhere in the middle of it all, my mother had written, "Thank God you're okay, sweetheart. We'll figure out the insurance." I read the words twice, not because they were surprising, but because they were so stunningly familiar, so achingly in character, that they stung worse than any slap. I didn't need to scroll to know what had happened. Dylan had taken that overpriced motorcycle, the one he'd been told to go easy on, and treated it like a toy until it became shrapnel. And instead of anger or accountability or even a sliver of reflection, there was just more performance, more dramatics, more coddling, more noise. I didn't comment. I didn't text. I didn't send some passive-aggressive message or try to extract guilt from silence. I simply closed the app, powered off my phone, and returned to my work because there was a submission deadline in 48 hours, and I refused to let his chaos pull focus. Not anymore. Not ever again. Later that week, while Dylan was presumably recovering at home on the couch surrounded by sympathy casseroles and new followers, I stood in the office of the department head listening as she told me, without even looking up from her clipboard, that I'd been selected as the commencement speaker for my graduating class. Valedictorian. The word felt foreign in her mouth but electric in mine, as if speaking it aloud would change something fundamental in the air around me. I thanked her, too calmly maybe, and walked out of that office with my heart hammering so hard I thought I could feel it in my teeth. Because even though I had predicted this moment, mapped it out in late-night study sessions and calculated it in coffee-stained planners, it was still something else entirely to hold it in my hands and know it was mine, not handed down or borrowed or apologized for. Just earned. I didn't tell anyone at home. Not my parents. Not Dylan. Not even in the safe, emotionally sterile form of a forwarded email. I let the silence expand, grow roots, take shape around me like armor, and instead I called Claire, who screamed so loudly through the phone I had to hold it away from my ear. That night, we bought a bottle of champagne with a fake ID she swore was real, and we sat on the roof of our building drinking straight from the bottle and yelling affirmations into the night air like two drunk prophets. And then came the speech. Writing it wasn't hard. What was hard was keeping it restrained, calibrated, sharp without being cruel. I knew this would be my one moment with the mic, my one sanctioned, public opportunity to say everything I had swallowed for 4 years, everything I had folded into quiet nods and polite silences and unanswered texts. But I also knew that I didn't want to waste it on bitterness. I didn't want to drag anyone by name or list my injuries like a laundry receipt. I wanted the words to sting, not because they were mean, but because they were true. So I began with the idea of erasure, of what it means to be present but invisible. I talked about how silence can be louder than cruelty, how some people mistake neglect for character building, and how being overlooked doesn't make you invisible, it makes you dangerous, because no one sees you coming when you decide to rise. Professor Miles offered to proofread it. He read it once, then set it down and said, "This is going to burn. And they won't even know they're on fire." I asked him if I should tone it down. He laughed. Absolutely not. A week before graduation, I received an automated message from the registrar's office reminding students to reserve seats for family members. I read it 3 times, then closed the tab without clicking the link. If they showed up, they'd stand. If they didn't, they'd never know what they missed. Either way, it wasn't my burden anymore. The same night, I got a text from my father. It was the first in months. "Hey, kiddo. Dylan's home. Doing better. We're real proud of him. Hope school's going okay." I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say that could fit into a message. The words I needed to say were longer than a screen could hold, heavier than a read receipt could carry, and I'd saved them all for that stage, that microphone, that single, irreversible moment when everyone would finally listen, not because they cared, but because they couldn't ignore me anymore. And I had no intention of wasting it. By the time the final week of classes arrived, the campus had taken on that strange, electric stillness that only exists when something enormous is about to end. When everyone walks a little faster between buildings with earbuds in and backpacks sagging from the weight of final papers, when the library becomes a second home and vending machines dispense meals disguised as snacks, and all the graduates-to-be begin measuring time not in days, but in deadlines, trying to pretend that the next chapter isn't bearing down like a freight train they're only half prepared to board. I wasn't afraid of what came next. If anything, I'd spent the past 4 years preparing for life beyond this place with the kind of focused, almost surgical precision that had become my armor. But even I couldn't deny the strange sense of vertigo that came with realizing I was exactly 1 week away from standing on a stage with a microphone, a spotlight, and no net. The speech was finished. Tight. Clean. Emotional without being sentimental, sharp without being cruel. Professor Miles had reviewed it twice. Claire had listened to me practice it at least 5 times, once while brushing her teeth and another while crying over her own delayed thesis, and the school had already printed the program listing my name beside the title. Commencement Speaker, Class of Emerson State University. It was official. It was happening. And still, I had told no one at home. Not because I was trying to be dramatic or secretive, but because I didn't trust myself not to flinch if they responded the way they always did, with a half-hearted "wow," followed by an immediate update about Dylan's latest drama. As if my milestones were merely pit stops along the way to his never-ending series of self-made emergencies. I had imagined the scene too many times, my mother reading the message while stirring something on the stove, nodding absently and saying, "That's great, sweetie," then turning to my father to say, "Dylan's therapist says he might be close to a breakthrough." Or worse, no response at all, just the familiar silence of emotional indifference, the one that always made me feel like I was shouting into a canyon that never echoed back. So I said nothing. And in the absence of expectation, I found a strange kind of peace. Until the calls started. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before graduation, when my phone buzzed for the first time. "Dad, home," was on the screen, and I stared at the name for a full minute before letting it ring out. No voicemail. No follow-up text. Just silence. I told myself it was probably a pocket dial, or maybe he needed something for taxes, or maybe Dylan had applied to a job and listed me as a reference without asking again. I dismissed it. Buried myself in a final round of edits for my portfolio. Then, 2 hours later, it rang again. Same number. Same silence. I didn't answer the third call either, not because I was angry or hurt, but because something about the timing felt too strange, too coincidental, too deliberate to be ignored. And I didn't want anything to shatter the quiet bubble I had so carefully constructed around this moment. I knew if I picked up, I might get dragged back into whatever fresh disaster was currently unfolding at home, and I couldn't afford the emotional detour. Not now. Not with 3 days left. That night, Claire came into our room holding her laptop like it was radioactive and said, "I think your speech leaked." At first, I thought she was joking. She joked about everything, especially when she was anxious. But when she turned the screen toward me, I saw it. A blurry video, posted to a student forum, showing me rehearsing on stage in the empty auditorium. My voice echoing through the vast space, the words crisp and clear even through the tinny microphone feed. Someone had snuck in, recorded it, and uploaded it with the caption, "Valedictorian goes off, poetry or petty?" The video had already racked up a few thousand views. The comment section was divided between praise and confusion. Some people loved it, calling it raw, honest, and long overdue. Others were clearly uncomfortable, asking if it was about someone specific, or if the school should allow personal grievances in a public speech. And then, buried halfway down the thread, was a comment that made my stomach clench, not because of what it said, but because of who had posted it. The username was ldawson62. The comment was short. Just 4 words. "Is this about us?" I read it twice, then 3 more times, as if repetition would offer clarity, or maybe even reassurance, but it didn't. All it did was confirm what I already suspected, that somehow, some way, they knew. Maybe not the full story, maybe not the entire scope of everything I'd held back over the years, but enough to recognize themselves in my words, enough to feel the sting of what I had left unsaid. I didn't reply. I didn't like the comment. I didn't even click on the profile to confirm it was really her. I just closed the laptop, turned off my phone, and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor until Claire broke the silence by saying, very softly, "You okay?" And I was. Or I thought I was. Or maybe I was just too far into it now to stop. The next morning, I received an email from the events office. The subject line read, "Family seat reservations still open. Final reminder." Inside was a polite message asking us to confirm the number of seats needed for our guests, along with a warning that after Friday at noon, no more would be added. I stared at the form for a long time. All it asked for was a number. I left it blank. Because no matter how many chairs I could have requested, the truth was that the people who were supposed to be sitting in them had already missed every moment that mattered. They'd missed my acceptance letter, my scholarship award, my first published article, my nights crying over rejection letters, and my mornings waking up with a grin because I'd gotten something no one thought I deserved. They'd missed everything that made me me. And now they could miss this too. Not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but because some stories are better told to strangers than to people who only think they know you. Because some moments are meant to be witnessed by those who stayed, who listened, who believed, like Claire, like Professor Miles, like every reader who sent me a message after reading my words and said, "I felt that." And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Graduation morning arrived beneath a sky so impossibly blue it almost felt staged, like the world itself had paused its usual chaos just long enough to cast a soft spotlight over the proceedings, and as I stood in front of the mirror in my cap and gown, iron pressed to perfection, the sash neatly draped across my shoulders, I realized that for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like I was preparing for something I had to prove, didn't feel the familiar pressure of needing to outperform someone's doubt or earn a sliver of recognition from people too distracted or self-absorbed to look up from their own narratives. No, today felt different, not because I was stepping into the kind of success that could finally silence the people who had underestimated me, but because I no longer cared whether or not they were listening. The walk to the stadium was quiet, not in the sense of soundlessness, but in the way everything felt muted, suspended, like I was passing through the final page of a chapter I'd been reading so long I had forgotten it could ever end. Students in robes shuffled around me, nervous laughter echoing across the grass, camera shutters clicking from all directions, proud parents waving from barricades, siblings holding up handmade signs, and friends snapping group selfies as if they could freeze time before the inevitable scatter. I passed them like a ghost moving through someone else's celebration, and it was only when Claire caught up to me bright-eyed, breathless, the heels she swore she could walk and already giving her blisters, that I anchored myself back into the moment. She looked at me, scanned my face for any hint of panic, then leaned in and whispered, "You ready to murder this crowd with the calm fury of a woman who's been silently disrespected for 2 decades?" I laughed quietly, then said, "More than they'll ever be." The backstage area was a flurry of last-minute instructions and misplaced honor cords, with administrators buzzing like insects in suits and faculty members standing in small circles, sipping bottled water and complimenting each other's regalia. I stood off to the side, clutching my speech printed, annotated, rehearsed to death, and watching the ceremony unfold through a small curtain slit that revealed the sprawling crowd slowly filling into rows of folding chairs. It looked endless, a sea of hats and sunglasses and program booklets, and somewhere, probably near the back, my name sat in print on a page most people wouldn't read. The first clue that something was off came when the event coordinator, a perky graduate student with a clipboard and a headset, tapped my shoulder and said, with a confused smile, "Hey, do you have family in attendance? I just realized we never got a seat count for you, but a couple showed up with your last name and no reservation." I didn't flinch. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. I simply said, "If there's no seats, they can stand." She blinked, caught between protocol and human decency, then nodded and walked away, her voice already buzzing in the headset again. I didn't follow her with my eyes. I didn't peek through the curtain to see if it was them. I didn't care if they had driven 2 hours or 20 minutes, or if they were sitting in the parking lot Googling how to sneak into a graduation without wristbands. Because I had given them every chance. I had given them years. And they had missed it, not just the milestones, but the moments in between, the late nights and early mornings, the essays rewritten until dawn, the competitions, the rejection letters, the published wins, the first time someone called me a force, the first time I believed it. They had missed me. When my name was called and I stepped onto that stage, the applause rose up in a wave, not wild, not overwhelming, but full, respectful, the kind of applause reserved for someone who had shown up consistently, done the work quietly, and earned her place not by pushing others down but by refusing to let anyone hold her back. I stood behind the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out into the crowd, not searching for familiar faces, not waiting for any nod of acknowledgement, just letting the moment fill the air between us like smoke. And then I spoke. Not with venom, not with bitterness, but with the deliberate clarity of someone who had waited a long, long time to be heard. I began, not by thanking those who had helped me, but by addressing the ones who hadn't, not with accusation, but with truth. I talked about silence, not as absence, but as something you can drown in, the way a child learns to lower her voice when interruptions become the norm, the way a teenager folds herself smaller to fit the space between someone else's disappointments. I spoke about how some students are cheered for simply showing up, while others have to win a war just to be seen, and how even then, they're often accused of arrogance for daring to name the cost. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The people who needed to recognize themselves would feel it. I ended the speech with a line that I hadn't rehearsed, one that had come to me just the night before while lying awake, staring at the ceiling of my room and wondering if victory could ever feel soft. I looked out into the crowd and said, sometimes, the people who were supposed to clap the loudest are the ones who never even bought a ticket. And sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't anger or distance, it's doing it anyway, beautifully, fully, without waiting for anyone to notice. There was a pause. Then applause. This time, it was thunderous. When the ceremony ended and hats were tossed and photos began in every direction, I moved quickly, weaving through clusters of families and graduates, shaking a few hands, accepting a few hugs, but not lingering. I walked to the side gate of the stadium, where Claire was already waiting, holding 2 iced lemonades and wearing the biggest grin I'd ever seen. She handed me one, raised hers in a mock toast, and said, "To doing it anyway." We didn't take a selfie. We didn't stop to look back. We just walked toward the street, toward whatever came next, 2 women who had clawed their way through noise and neglect to arrive here, unapologetic, unbothered, undefeated. My phone buzzed once in my pocket as we crossed the street. I didn't check it right away. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I already knew what it would say. Later, in the passenger seat of Claire's car, I finally glanced down. One message. From my mother. We didn't know. We really didn't know. I stared at it for a long moment, let the weight of it settle somewhere beneath my ribs, then slowly tapped and held my thumb over the screen. Delete. No reply. Because some stories don't need sequels. Some endings are exactly what they are, final.